Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is Adrian Pandev, business and immigration attorney, and today we're going to chat about the E-2 visa and how it can lead to permanent residence. So the question I get all the time is, does the E-2 visa lead to a green card? And while the short answer is no, there's actually several planning opportunities here, and in this video I want to kind of guide you through the analysis and how to best think about this question. So the bottom line is, the E-2 visa is a temporary non-immigrant visa, right? So what that means is it's issued for a specific period of time, anywhere from a few months to 5 years. And during that time, you can use this visa to enter the country. And while you're in the country, you can work for that E-2 treaty enterprise, basically the company that you formed in the US, right? But that being said, it is temporary, right? You have to, whenever the visa expires, you have to renew the visa or you have to file for an extension of status. Also, it is limiting. You can only work for the E-2 enterprise if you're the investor, right? So this is why the question comes up once you realize that, hey, I like working in the US, the business is taking off, I need something more permanent. I don't want to be afraid that one day they won't renew my visa, and now I've invested all this capital, I have this growing business, I need more security than that. And that is perfectly fair, and it's genuinely something I see definitely every week. I was about to say every day, but most definitely every week I hear this from clients and prospective clients, right, in my practice. Now, the way people think about it often is that, well, I've made this investment, I've received this E-2 visa, well, am I just, after so many years, just going to get a green card in the mail, right? And then that is just not how it works, to put it bluntly, right? It doesn't matter how many years you've had an E-2. In fact, I know people who have been in the US on an E-2 status for over 10 years, right? And actually, I know someone who's been here for 25 years in E-2 status. So the bottom line is, first of all, not everybody wants to do this. And second of all, and most importantly for the purposes of this video, your E-2 visa will not automatically convert to a green card, right? But this doesn't mean that there are no other options, right? And in fact, there are quite a few, and I want to encourage everyone that is on an E-2 or is considering an E-2, and in the back of their mind, they're thinking about, hey, maybe if it takes off, or if I like it in the US, I may consider permanent residence, that the E-2 does not shut this door. And in fact, I've had several cases. I mean, I think it's fairly common, especially once the business is successful in the US, where E-2, visa holders, status holders apply for various permanent residence categories that I'm going to go over in a second, obtain permanent residence through that filing, but initially started their journey in the US through this E-2 visa, right? So let's go through the options, right? So the first kind of obvious option that many people ask me about is EB-5, right? The EB-5 is the investment green card category, right? Permanent residence category. So the question is, can I convert my E-2 to an EB-5 green card? The short answer is yes, you can, but keep in mind, and I have recorded a separate video on the differences between the two. The requirements for the EB-5 are different, and they're in many ways much more stringent. So first of all, you have to make at least a minimum investment of $800,000, and you have to create at least 10 US full-time jobs. So whether that conversion from E-2, EB-5 is super seamless, and the way people think about that often is, hey, can I just use the same E-2 enterprise, the same E-2 business I have to convert it to an EB-5? Well, you have to first analyze whether your business is one that can support 10 jobs, whether you've at least invested $1,050,000 or $800,000, depending on whether you're in a targeted employment area. And if those, if you meet those requirements, well, then it's definitely an option, right? A couple of things about EB-5 that I want to throw out that many don't consider. One, you don't necessarily have to use the E-2 business. So you can, while on an E-2, consider investing in a regional center or, pursuing other EB-5 opportunities. And then the final thing I want to say on EB-5 is that many don't consider the time frame of how long it takes to get an EB-5 green card. So the EB-5 green card is generally a multi-year journey, right? And depending on how much time you have left on your E-2 or what your plans are, or if you have any children that are aging out, it is very important to know that that's a longer process and you should plan ahead. But to sum it all up, you can obtain permanent residence through EB-5 as an E-2 visa holder. Now, another category that we see very often is the EB-1 multinational manager. And that one, it's kind of, I tell everyone the easiest way to think about it, it's the permanent residence category of the L1 visa. Now, it's not quite that simple, but it's an easy way to think about it. And what it is basically, if you have a foreign affiliate company where you have worked in a managerial role for at least one of the last 3 years, and that company is also actively doing business, it has significant employees, right? And your US E-2 business is also actively obviously doing business, it has several employees, and they're both kind of growing larger organizations, then you could potentially use this EB-1 multinational manager category to obtain permanent residence. Now, one big advantage of this category is that it falls into EB-1. EB-1 is, generally speaking, a faster moving category than EB-5 and EB-2 and EB-3. Now, I say this, and it's not always this simple depending on the visa bulletin, but the bottom line, before you can even consider qualifying under the EB-1C multinational manager or executive category, there has to be 2 affiliated businesses, one abroad, one in the US, and you have to have worked for the one abroad for at least 1 out of the last 3 years, right? Which works for some, but many don't have that foreign business where they worked in a managerial, and I should say foreign affiliate business where they worked in a managerial capacity before. And I'll try to shoot videos on all of these categories so that I can explain them better. But keep in mind, EB-1C is definitely one option. The other one we see is, and I'm going to kind of combine 2 here. One is the EB-2 national interest waiver and the EB-1A extraordinary ability permanent residence categories. So to start with the EB-1A, it's the extraordinary ability category. So to put it bluntly, you have to demonstrate to USCIS that you as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, are truly extraordinary and at the very top of your field. What kind of evidence, just to give you some ideas, right, how you can prove this? Well, one is, just to put it bluntly, tax returns and tremendous success by the business, especially if there was a lower investment amount and the business has just really blossomed and grown. That's great evidence. Also, raising capital. Now, side note here, raising capital in the E-2 context can be a bit complicated because you have to maintain control of the business to qualify for the E-2 visa. But anyway, that can be structured around. But if you have raised substantial capital, especially from major, institutional investors, right, that could really prove that you're an extraordinary entrepreneur. And then finally, one thing I always look at is just the number of employees, right? Like if you've grown this business to where it has, many employees, especially if it has 100 plus whatever employees, well, then that's truly something extraordinary, especially if it was started from scratch, right? Now, similar to the EB-1A, but different, the EB-2 national interest waiver, as its name says, focuses more on the national interest of the United States, right? So are you benefiting the United States is a simple way to think about it. Now, just a side note on all of these categories, I could probably shoot 15-20 minute videos just explaining each and every one of them, and I will try to do this in the future. But for purposes of this video, I am not going in depth into all of these categories, right? But the EB-2 national interest waiver, like I said, you should think of it as, is your presence in the U.S. Sufficiently in the national interest? Keep in mind, it can't just be a city or state, in the national interest, right, to warrant issuing you permanent residence or granting you permanent residence. To be honest, from an evidence standpoint, I look at how much the business has scaled, how many employees it has, what kind of revenue it has, does it have investors, does it have important players in the industry interested in it, working with it. So very similar to EB-1A, but the category is different. And here for EB-2 national interest waiver purposes, I also look at what the business does a lot more, right? Because certain businesses, especially, I see this a lot with medtech companies, right? They just fit the national interest waiver argument really well because the product that's being produced is by default in the national interest because it involves healthcare, right, and helping patients who are battling diseases or other medical issues. Now, please don't take this as Adrian said, only MedTech, EB2 national interest waiver. Not at all. I'm just giving you an example. And there's very many arguments you can make that are similar. Now, outside of these, call them self-petitioned cases, right? Because EB5, EB1A, EB2 national interest waiver, these are all cases where you can, to put it bluntly, file the applications yourself. You don't need a sponsor, right? There's a couple of other things I want to highlight for everyone, right? So what I see a lot with the individuals on E2 is that by working in the business in the US, right, and just transacting with others, you meet service providers, you meet clients, customers, you go to conferences, etc., right? And as you're growing the business, you start to create connections. And what I see is that a lot of times connections are created in the same industry and or at least fields in which the investor, the owner, has a background. And I see a lot of other companies completely unrelated to the investor who would agree to sponsor the E2 visa holder for permanent residence, right? Through the perm process, through their own company, right? As long as the E2 visa holder agrees to join that company and work for it once they become a permanent resident. So this is kind of an outside thought, but I see it quite a bit, and don't underestimate, like if you're hesitant about applying for an E2 visa because you're saying, oh, but it's not permanent residence and how will I become permanent resident? I will say that those clients I've had who've come to the US on an E2 visa and considered applying for permanent residence and wanted to, have been able generally to do it. And this avenue that I'm describing here last through, a completely different employer is one I've seen fairly frequently, right? So simply put, by being in the country, by being here on this E2 visa and making connections, it opens up other doors. And the final avenue that I want to mention, which completely gets overlooked for reasonable reasons, is basically family-based petitions. So I see this quite a bit too, especially with sort of young entrepreneur E2 investors, is especially for countries, right, where the E2 is issued for 5 years. I see it very often where someone comes to the US on an E2 visa, sometimes they even extend it, right? They've been here for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And very often, right, depending on when they move in their sort of life to the US, they find that life partner in the US, right? And very often the way they obtain permanent residence is through a marriage-based, family-based filing, which has nothing to do with any of the investment, employer, right, visa categories. But it's something I want to mention again to my previous point, that by being here, right, and by working and growing in the US, you're making all these relationships, whether personal or business, and they open up doors too. And I know it's kind of unrelated to the main categories that I assume everyone's most interested in watching this video, but I do want to mention it because I think it's important. So the final point I want to make on this E2 to GreenCard transition, and although I'm making it last, I think it's critical and it's a very important thing to consider. The bottom line is the E2 visa is a non-immigrant visa. In your E2 visa application, you made an attestation, you confirmed to the U.S. consular officer, the U.S. government, that at the end of your U.S. stay, right, in E2 status, you're going to depart the United States, right? Now, if you're applying for permanent residence, you're contradicting what you had said in that application. Now, I'm not saying this to scare you. I have a very long list of clients who have adjusted status from E2 to permanent residence or applied through consular processing for an immigrant visa and obtained permanent residence that way. What I want to highlight is that this transition, although there's all these options, the transition itself has to be very carefully planned out. I would not recommend for anyone on an E2 to just start filing any applications for permanent residence without having a very thorough plan on how will I qualify for the relevant category and then obtain permanent residence, and then 2, how do I actually transition from E2 to becoming a permanent resident without creating an issue from the fact that I am on a non-immigrant status, now transition into an immigrant status, right? So again, I don't want to scare you with this. done it many, many times. Long list of clients. I would say E2s are a very big part of my practice, and many of my initially E2 clients are now permanent residents. Many are actually citizens now. But please don't just jump in here without having a proper plan. And anyway, this video I think is getting too long already. I hope this was helpful. I will try to continue to record videos, and if you do find them helpful, I would appreciate it if you could, like the video, subscribe, follow me on the channel, and if there's any questions or any other videos, right, that I could shoot to answer those questions, please put them in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.